Hi again. Welcome to my attic. Grumpy old Grognard here, and I've finally get to make the video that I've wanted to make since I picked YouTube back up. But now with the WotC drama seeming to fade, I think it's time for me to actually talk to you about stuff that I care about, and I'm really glad things worked out the way they did, because you know it's not the best game, but it's still my favorite, probably because it was my first love, and that's Dungeons and Dragons, specifically first edition Dungeons and Dragons. Not just because it was my first love, though, also because I sincerely believe that first edition Dungeons and Dragons is, in fact, a better game than fifth edition. And I'm going to explain to you why I think that. If you are tuning in to see me hate on 5th edition, you're wrong, okay? Look, I can be kind of mean. I don't have a lot of tolerance for mediocrity. And if I had to describe the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, that's the word I would use, mediocre. It is not good. It is not great. I have respect for good. I have respect for great. I have no respect for mediocrity. So my tiers, my quality tiers with role-playing games go great, good, crap. Okay? By that standard, okay, this is crap. But it's really not a terrible game. There are a few things in it that I actually kind of like. Even have it considered and even have adopted into my homebrew, my rules, which are more first edition, but still, okay? Inspiration points. Now, all the OSR guys are like, oh. Inspiration points is not a new game mechanic. This is not something that WotC figured out. This is not something that WotC made up. Inspiration points, I haven't done any homework on the subject, but the first time I remember seeing them was here. West End Game Star Wars. They called them force points. Okay? But that's the first time I remember seeing anything like inspiration in a role-playing game. It might not be the first time they were ever used, but it's an old mechanic. It's been around for a long time. And yes, it does tend to create a much more merciful environment for the players. I think limiting them to one is a good idea. The force points could get a little out of control, but different kind of game, right? I have not implemented inspiration points into my first edition campaign. I guess these days it's more of a second edition campaign, but still thinking about it. I haven't completely eliminated the idea. Another good thing that came out of 5th edition was the advantage-disadvantage mechanic. I like that mechanic. Again, I have not implemented it formally into my AD&D campaign, but it's not a bad mechanic. And in fact, again, this is not an innovation from Wizards of the Coast. This is not a 5th edition or even a 4th edition innovation. This actually comes from original D&D. I don't remember the name of the monster. Sorry. But there's a monster, kind of a luck monster, that dispenses advantage as part of its attack, as part of its special abilities. And, you know, in terms of should we use pluses or minuses, there's certain good arguments for using advantage, disadvantage. I think Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition uses it a little too freely. Not everything is quite that drastic, but it's a good mechanic, and I have used it informally on die rolls on a few occasions. So yeah, advantage disadvantage is a good rule. So you know what 5th edition did give us that I consider an excellent mechanic, and that I have. You know, this is where all the OSR guys are going to start screaming and shaking their fists and calling me a phony. But I have implemented into my second edition AD&D campaign. I think it's a great innovation. is spell slots. Okay, this is a good idea. The whole Vancian magic, wasn't a big fan of it ever. I was never able to find a mechanic that worked in lieu of it, right? Spell points, forget it. Just mana points, whatever you want to call them, don't work. If you let players have spell points, and the problem isn't high level spells if they have spell points. The problem is they can spam low level spells, right? You can just magic missile, magic missile, magic missile, magic missile, just keep shooting them off all day, and still have half of them left over when you when you go to bed at night. So no, spell points didn't work. Vancian magic never felt quite right to me. Spell slots works for me. I like that. So I have actually implemented spell slots into my second edition campaign. And another good thing that 5th edition gave us is, nothing. I can't honestly think of anything else that 5th edition is giving us. Other than that, in every sense of the word, I prefer Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. 1st edition is my favorite. I've moved my campaign kind of over to 2nd edition, not because I love the rules, but because they're not substantially different, and because they're supported by the virtual tabletop that I use. Fantasy Grounds is my preferred virtual tabletop. So I run my campaigns 2nd edition because the rules are available. OSRIC rules are also available. A little reluctant to use them because they don't always get supported as quickly during updates. And I don't need the headache of trying to get my campaign started and finding out that the OSRIC plugin isn't working. So I don't use it. Otherwise, I would definitely use it. But there are a number of reasons that I prefer Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And the first of them is just game mechanics. And I know that the game mechanics on Advanced Dungeons and Dragons seem a little... They are old. They're old. They're not modern and by any stretch of the imagination. But they have certain significant advantages. Now, the first of those is simplicity. Now, I know there's this narrative that, but 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons is the simplest rule set ever. Yeah, the only people that would possibly think that are people who have never actually played Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. The rules are quirky, but in terms of running a game, they're a lot simpler in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons than 5th edition. By quirky, I'm talking about things, and these are the things that the new D&Ders just, they throw their hands up and they howl with anger about things like descending armor class, combat matrices. And in terms of the design quality, I am the first to jump on board with the idea that this is not the best way to do it. And if you ask me what the best role-playing game, best fantasy role-playing game is, I'm going to tell you it's Castles and Crusades. Okay? It's not Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons holds a special place in my heart because, because it was my first love. Okay? But Castles and Crusades is a better game. And one of the many reasons that I consider it a better game is that it has more modern rules. And that includes things like Ascending Armor Class. But Descending Armor Class is not an issue of complexity. Okay? Using a combat matrix is not a complicated thing. Okay? It's just, and using THAC0 is not a complicated thing. It's subtraction. It's literally lower school math, okay? It's not complicated. It's quirky, but it's not complicated. And that's what Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is. It's quirky. It's old and it doesn't follow a lot of modern gaming conventions because it was the first time this had ever been done, and the modern gaming conventions didn't exist yet. So the game is quirky, but it is still much, much, much simpler than 5th edition. Okay? The simplicity of play in original D&D, advanced D&D, basic expert D&D, they're not even comparable. Okay? And simplicity has a lot of advantages and disadvantages and elements that are both. But it is my personal preference. Disadvantages. I'm not even sure this is a disadvantage. Let's put this under both. Okay? Advanced Dungeons and Dragons did not have a rule for everything. Okay? There's no like written, this is how far a person can jump in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Okay? That's left up to the dungeon master to kind of just use to explain, right? So when you try to jump a gap in Dungeons and Dragons, there's no rule for it. What you get from the dungeon master is a ruling. And that's the thing with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, is you have more rulings from the referee than rules. Okay? Now, again, that's an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is simplicity. The disadvantage is it kind of puts the dungeon master in an awkward position, and he has to do some storytelling. Now, the way around that is to say something to the effect, when they say how far across is it, you don't say it's 8 feet. Okay, you don't say that. What you say is you can't be sure, and you might be able to, like an unarmored person might be able to jump it, but it looks like that would be risky. And that is the end of that description. And if the players decide that they want to strip off their armor and go for that jump, you let them make an attribute roll. And if they decide they don't want to do that, they don't have to do that. Okay? So there's no rule saying if you have an 18 strength and a 15 dexterity, you can jump 11 feet. There's no rule that says that. It's just a ruling from the dungeon master. Okay? So there's an advantage to this, a big advantage to this. This type of simple rule set. And I know that a lot of players are going to be shocked by this, but most dungeon masters are immediately going to go, yeah, it's true. And that is that Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is much easier to dungeon master than 5th edition. When you're playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, you're not dealing with a bunch of monsters with feats and skills and special abilities. They'll have a few special attacks, and you'll have to know them. But as a general rule, it's not that hard to jump into the skin of a monster in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and fight with him effectively. Likewise, the players don't have a bunch of feats and skills and unpredictable elements. So it also becomes much easier to have encounter balance, which is kind of funny because OSR actually kind of eschews encounter balance. But nevertheless, for all its, for the fact that the game is designed not to offer balanced encounters, right? The game is designed to throw enemies at you that are too easy or too hard, right? There are going to be times when the only way to survive an encounter is to run away, and that's built into the system, okay? But, okay, it's still a better balanced encounter system because there are fewer variables that need to be considered. So if you have 5 first-level fighters fighting 5 first-level goblins, the fighters will probably win, but the goblins have a chance in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. In 5th edition, those goblins might as well just kiss their asses goodbye. They don't have a prayer. Okay, and we'll get to that too, because that's an issue of power, and that comes to philosophy, and we'll get to that. Okay, but it's also an issue of balance for the mechanics part of my bone with 5th edition. Now, the fact that the game rules are simpler, and that the monsters are simpler, and that the characters are simpler, does not make the game easier. Okay, that's a criticism I've heard. Simplicity of those games are easy. No, actually, the mortality rate in original Dungeons and Dragons was ridiculous. Ridiculous. Okay, I'm a big OSR fan, and I think death should definitely be part of Dungeons and Dragons. But I've even nerfed it a little bit in my 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Even those games were a little too deadly for my taste. Okay, but 5th edition, it's gotten stupid, and we'll get to that later, because again, that's an issue of game philosophy. The point I'm making now is that just because the rules are simpler doesn't make the game easier. It makes the game harder. Okay, the original Dungeons and Dragons, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, Basic, Expert Dungeons and Dragons, these are all much more difficult games than 5th edition. And that's they're simple, the rules are simpler, and the games are more difficult, and that's the God's honest truth. And I'll stretch that all the way to Castles and Crusades. Okay? The rules are simpler. That's one of the beauties of Castles and Crusades. But it's a much, much harder game to beat. You know, the encounters are much more dangerous and much more difficult. So, I think simplicity is a positive. But I don't think it's a positive that 5th edition has. I think that's a narrative. I think that's kind of a myth that's been adopted by a lot of people who don't have any real experience with the older editions of the game. Because anyone who's played Advanced Dungeons & Dragons can tell you that it's really not that complicated. It's quirky, but it's not that complicated. You have to get used to using different dice for different things. Sure. You have to make your thief rolls on percentile dice. The horror. It's not hard. Okay. Just the fact that you're doing everything on a 20-sided dice in 5th edition doesn't make it a simpler game. Okay, any idiot can understand the concept of throwing percentile dice. It's not complicated. Okay, it's quirky. Okay, the actual fact that the way that there are no skills, there are no feats. Okay, in old school Dungeons and Dragons, there's nothing like that, and that is where the complexity comes from, and that's where a lot of the other problems with 5th edition come from too. And we'll get to that. Another thing that I despise, and I'm using the word here quite literally, I despise about 5th edition, is the healing and death systems that they have in that game. I mean, I have problems with all of the Dungeons and Dragons healing and death systems, okay? The idea that you are fighting the good fight, and you are trading blows, and you are taking injuries, and you are handing injuries out, but everybody fights at full capacity right up until the moment they drop dead. Doesn't make any sense to me. Or right up until the moment they're knocked out of the fight. Doesn't make any sense to me. Games that have a death spiral have a great deal more verisimilitude. What kind of asshole says verisimilitude? I do. That's going to be our word of the day. Our word of the day, children, is verisimilitude. Because actually that is a very important word to me. Verisimilitude, look it up. It's a great word. You should know it. But it basically has to do with things feeling real that aren't real. Okay? Games that have a death spiral, the games like Rollmaster, where you take injuries. You know, nobody dies in Rollmaster because they've run out of hit points. You die in Rollmaster because you've taken critical hits. Now, sometimes the result of that critical hits is you run out of hit points. But there's a death spiral in Rollmaster. As you take hits and accumulate criticals, some of those criticals are very minor. A -1 here, a -2 there, maybe you get a nasty headshot that kind of knocks the wind out of you and leaves you wobbly. You get a fat old -3, which in Rollmaster would be reflected in 5% increments. So a -1 would be -5, -3 would be -15. So over the length of a combat, those add up. And whoever is taking the damage is the one that's likely to lose because they got these minuses piling up on their defensive abilities. That's called a death spiral, okay? That's much more realistic than in Dungeons and Dragons, where everybody just fights full tilt with, absolute maximum, optimized for battle right up until the moment they fall down, okay? So that's a problem in all the editions of D&D. But it's one I can forgive. It's one I can live with. But once you start getting into 5th edition, I mean, okay. There's no real risk of death because of the death system in 5th edition, right? Doesn't matter. A giant squashes you with his club, taking you down to -36 hit points. Now, that should leave you a puddle on the ground, but it just leaves you at 0 hit points and you start making death saves. And some idiot can just walk up to you with a med kit, a first aid kit, and just heal you, and that's not even a roll. There's no medicine roll, right? There's nothing. You just, I'll dribble a little cure light wounds in it, and I'll just, no. Okay? No, a cure light wounds shouldn't snap you out of a death like that. It shouldn't even, you should be dead. That should be an insta-kill. Okay? Giant squashes you with club, takes you down to -36 hit points. That should be an insta-kill. Okay? So, I don't like the death system in 5th edition. Okay? And again, it's all falling back on philosophy, and we will get to philosophy. Now, I'm not a big fan of the Dungeons and Dragons death system either. We have a lot of old school guys who are like, 0 hit points is dead. Well, no. Yeah, no, I'm not on board with that. 0 hit points is dead? No. I'm not on board with that. I have my own house rules. I'll give those to you. I have my own house rules, but no, 0 hit points is not dead. Even back in the Middle Ages, when people were getting treated like, oh, look how much blood he's lost. Quick, get the leeches. Let's take more blood. Even people disabled in combats back in the Middle Ages had a chance to survive. Okay? So the idea that you're going to fight at optimum battle right up until you drop dead just doesn't seem reasonable to me. So I think there should be a buffer zone. -10. Again, I think that might be a little bit too gentle. But yeah, okay. That's not a bad system. I used it for a long time. Especially at low level, doesn't seem right. But I've used it. Now, I do have my own homebrew death mechanics that I use in 2nd edition in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that involves system shock throws. Okay? But basically, your character can get down to negative whatever his hit points is to a maximum of -10. So if you are a cleric with 6 hit points, then you can get down to -6 before you die. Okay? Now, if you are dropped to 0, that's it. You're unconscious. We use the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons unconsciousness rules. You are down for a week, period. Okay? I'm a little more hardcore than the rules as written where it comes to that kind of injury. If you are at 0, I will allow that person to eventually be able to walk on their own, very much the way the official rules, the rules as written, allow. But if you go below 0, that's a different story. Okay? So here's my rule. If you're hit and you go below 0, but you're not to a point that would kill you, and I've already explained to you the threshold there, you make a system shock roll. If that system shock roll fails, you continue to take damage, 1 point a round, until you die. Again, very similar to the rules as written. I do not let you see the results of that system shock roll. You roll that one, and you don't get to see it. Okay? So you don't get to know whether you're living or dying. I want you to feel like you're dying. You also get a modifier to your system shock roll based on the type of weapon. If you have taken the hit from a blunt weapon rather than a bladed or a piercing weapon, I might give you a +3 on your system shock roll because it's less likely to cause external bleeding, but it can still cause internal bleeding. Getting hit with a blunt weapon does not necessarily mean you're not going to die. You're not going to continue to take damage. Okay. Again, we're at a situation where somebody can stop and help you, or not. They don't know any more than you do whether or not you're continuing to take damage. Okay? And at this point, you're out. You don't get to tell people, "Oh, I feel like I'm dying." No. They don't nobody gets to find out about your condition. If you are healed, you will get another system shock roll. If you make that system shock roll, then you will be able to treat rules as written. You will be able to not fight, not engage, not do anything, but you'll at least be mobile enough to get up and walk. Okay? So you can walk off the field if you make that second system shock roll. If you don't make that second system shock roll, you are going to basically be in a coma for a week. Okay? Nobody heals from these injuries unless they spend a week in bed rest, tended bed rest, okay? People taking care of you in a clean, safe place for a week, and you go up to 1 hit point, okay? And then I use kind of rules as written, 1 hit point, 3 if you're in bed rest per day, 1 per day of regular rest, 3 per day of like tended bed rest. Just that's your natural healing process. None of this nonsense about, we got breathed out. And I cannot understand how people can say, oh, but there's hardcore rules for 5th edition. Yeah, I know. I heard. It still doesn't make any sense to me that you got for the regular rules, give it a rest. You got breathed on by a dragon. You got dropped down to negative 35 hit points. Then you got healed up to 1 hit point with, nothing, with a medicine check. And then you're fine. Oh, you're not fine? Okay. Just rest for a day. And don't worry, all those 3rd degree birds will just go away. No, come on. It's too much. It's too much. I know there's a lot of folks who love video games. I love video games, but that's not the experience I'm looking for when I play a TTRPG. If I want that experience, I'll play Skyrim. Okay, that experience is it's cheap, it's easy. Anyone can find it anywhere. So the last game mechanic thing that really kills me about 5th edition, and I hate it, is the way they treat spells. Okay, spells are completely nerfed in 1st edition. In 5th edition. What do I mean by that? They're so obsessed with combat balance that they've overlooked using spells in any other way. Okay? A spell like Hold Person, for example, or Charm Person, okay? The bad guy gets a saving throw every 6 seconds. What the hell good is that outside of combat? What the hell good is that in combat, to be honest with you? And I realize this is an issue, again, of philosophy, fundamental game philosophy. Because what player wants to be paralyzed for the duration of an entire combat? That sucks. What player wants to die? That sucks. What player wants to die instantly from a poison? That sucks, right? But sometimes players have to die or the game has no stakes. And if you can't kill the players in any way, there's no stakes. And if that means sometimes a player is maybe not completely engaged with the game, I'm sorry, but that's the price we pay for putting real stakes in the game. Okay? if you want to just sit around and tell stories, you don't need dice to do that. Okay? If you want to play a game, if you want there to be risk and stakes, then yeah, there's going to be times where you're just laying there on the ground for the whole fight because you got took out early. You know, it's going to happen. It's part of the experience. Okay. Now I've nerfed my poison mechanics a little bit. I've got my own system for poison mechanics. I think it's, again, verisimilitude. I think it's a little unrealistic that any poison at all bites you and you instantly drop dead. Okay, yeah, that's kind of silly. Okay, but you should be at risk of dying, right? When something poisonous bites you. So my system, I basically have each monster has a poison. Each poisonous monster has a poisonous multiplier, a poison multiplier, which I use, which could be 0, right? You get bit by a giant black widow spider, the poison multiplier is 0, but it could be 0.1, 0.5, could be 1, could be 3, okay? And the poison multiplier, and here's the thing, again, quirky, right? The higher the poison multiplier, the less lethal that poison is likely to be, or at least the more time you have before you die. And the way I do poison is you get bit, you make your poison saving throw. If you fail, then the number you rolled on that fail is the number of rounds that you have before you actually lose consciousness. Okay? So if the poison multiplier is 1 and you roll a 4, you have 4 rounds before you lose consciousness. Okay? That gives you a chance to drink a cure poison, gives you a chance to have a cleric cast a spell on you. Again, this is going to be a hidden die. If I'm using the virtual tabletop, I'll make you throw it in the dice tower. If I'm using, if I'm doing it in person, and I have a dice tower, I'll let you use it, but I'm not going to let you see the result. And if I don't have a dice tower that day, I'm just going to throw the result secretly behind the screen, and you're just going to have to deal with it, okay? Because you don't know. You don't know how many rounds you've got before you lose consciousness. You just don't know. You don't know, okay? So if the poison multiplier is 0.1 and you roll a 4, that's it. You're going to die. I use a round off rule, not round up, not round down. Round off, like they taught you in 6th grade. Maths is bad. No, I don't subscribe to maths is bad. Math is good. Role-playing games are math. Everything is defined by math. If you have a problem with math, you shouldn't be playing Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so I have a round off rule. So anything 0.5 and down, rounds down. Anything above 0.5, so 0.5, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, rounds up. Okay, so if you have a 6, a 0.6, and you roll a 4, okay, you got a round. You got 1 round to try to survive. So I have my own homebrew rules to kind of nerf poison death. But you have to still have the death. Okay? Oh, and I do allow a second poison saving throw. Okay, again, I'm not trying to kill the characters here, but then I need the risk of death to be real. If you are a first level magic user with 4 hit points and you get hit with a longsword and take 8, you're dead. Okay? That's it. You're done. That character is dead. And at first level, it's very unlikely your friends can afford to raise you. Okay? If you're low level and you have a 16 or 18 or better saving throw against poison, and you get bit by a poison spider, if you don't have a cure poison potion, or if somebody in your party can't cure poison, you're probably going to die. Even using my mercy rolls, you're probably going to die. You may lay there screaming for 3 turns before it happens, or for 3 rounds before it happens, but you're dead. Okay? You've got a very high likelihood of dying if you don't have the resources. The philosophy that I'm talking about, I keep referring to, is the difference between advanced Dungeons and Dragons and 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons is that Advanced Dungeons and Dragons has a game-centric philosophy. What matters is the quality of the overall gaming experience for the group at the table, including the Dungeon Master. A lot of people seem to be very conveniently forget, especially when they want to start tweaking at the world that they're playing in. Oh, you have to change the world to suit my character because my personal player agency. Screw that shit, okay? The Dungeon Master is a player too. And he built a world, an amazing place for you to have amazing adventures in. And if you think that you should have the right to just walk in and change that vision, especially in an established campaign where everybody else is already hooked into this situation, and you think you should just be able to say, well, I think that's just wrong, and I want you to change the campaign to allow for this character because look at this wonderful character. Fuck you. Find another table. You don't belong here, okay? That is just obnoxious, okay? The Dungeon Master is a player too. He's put a lot of love and work and time into his world. Don't you dare presume to force him to try to change it so that you can realize your character vision. No. It is not his job to shape a world around your character. It is your job to shape a character around his world. And I don't want to hear any nonsense. Philosophy. I don't want to hear any nonsense about how, well, that's just stifling my player creativity. Oh, no. Your problem isn't that you're too creative for the campaign. Your problem is that you're not creative enough for this campaign, okay? Your problem is that you can't come up with something unique and interesting within the campaign's existing parameters. You're not creative enough to develop an interesting character with restrictions. You think that creativity is creating a build, okay? And that's a 5th edition thing, okay? That's not creativity. Creativity is being able to insert yourself into a vision in a unique way, okay? And that means restrictions, okay? You have to be more creative to create a unique and interesting character in a campaign that has more restrictions on character development. It's much easier to be creative in a campaign that lets you do anything you want, okay? That's not even creativity at that point. That's just an acid trip, okay? No, not buying it, don't want to hear it. If your player agency requires you to play a tiefling, assassin, bard, lost princess of the fairies, then find another table because you don't belong at mine. Okay? Philosophy. Okay? Another thing that happens, and this happened with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons too. Okay, this is not something that was invented by Wizards of the Coast. They had problems with this later down the road when Lorraine Williams took over the company. That was power creep. Okay, a whole bunch of horrific things happened when they were in business. They did very much the same thing that Wizards of the Coast is trying to do by getting players to buy more stuff, and they created these splash books: the Complete Fighter Handbook, the Complete Thief Handbook, Complete Bard Handbook, and the idea was to get players to buy these things. The problem, of course, being that this introduced power creep into the game, very much the way 5th edition is suffering from power creep. Every time they put out a new supplement, it's, it becomes harder and harder to balance encounters because the characters become more and more powerful. Okay, they're starting to come out with characters where, well, you're a fighter, but you picked the right background, so now you have like 1st level magic spells. Okay, well, who the hell wants to be a regular fighter if they can also have 1st level magic spells? No, I did not when I ran my 5th edition campaign, Player's Handbook with some restrictions, Dungeon Master's Guide, Monster Manual. Well, I was allowed to make as many monsters as I wanted. But no, don't come at me with, some new supplement, some new character subclass and tell me I want to be this and you have to let me because it's an official rule. No, I don't. No, I don't. This is my campaign. The rules as written become very unbalanced once you get up to the higher levels. It becomes very over, it becomes, the player characters become very overpowered as is. I'm not throwing power creep on top of that. No. Okay? We said the same thing back then with the splash books. People would say, look, I bought the complete Thief's Handbook. I want to use this new rule. And you go, no. And this is why those books didn't sell. Because the dungeon masters would be like, no, you're not using the rules. But you have to let us use the rules because it's in the book. Yeah, that book is not a part of my campaign. No, you may not use those rules. Well, then why did I buy the book? Well, you should have talked to me first. Okay? No, you cannot have persuasion as a skill. And this brings us also to social skills. Okay. Philosophy. Mechanics, philosophy. I'm not sure which this falls into. Okay? And that is the issue of roleplay, R-O-L-E, versus roleplay, R-O-L-L. Okay? The modern games are role-playing games with two L's. Okay? The introduction of social skills, way back, and again, to those wretched fucking splash books. There's some things you need to know about the Lorraine Williams, like the death throes of the original TSR. And one of them was that Lorraine Williams had no clue about role-playing games. She didn't know and she didn't care, okay? She would walk past the door and she'd see a bunch of grown men playing Dungeons and Dragons in a room, and she would have a fucking fit, screaming and yelling. And one of the first rules she made when she took the job as CEO of old TSR was no more playing Dungeons and Dragons at work. Okay, well, you know what that's called? That's called play testing. Okay? Those splash books where all those social skills were introduced, persuasion, diplomacy, intimidation. Diplomacy, I'm not so sure. I think that might have been Dragon Magazine. But the point is, it wasn't a part of the core rules. It wasn't a part of the original vision of Dungeons and Dragons. And it never should have become a part of the vision of Dungeons and Dragons, because Dungeons and Dragons is a role-playing game with an E. Okay? Persuading someone to do something is a matter of persuading them, convincing them that it is in their best interest. And we did this in the old days by role-playing with an E. Okay? There's no dice roll. We had to use our role-playing skills to persuade a non-player character that it was in their best interest to do this because. Okay? In 5th edition, they just roll a die. I want to try to persuade him. Yay! What are you trying to persuade the king to do? Give me his entire kingdom and let me marry his pretty daughter. No. Okay, no. Okay, no. Role-playing. Okay? You have to actually persuade them. You have to actually intimidate them. You have to actually behave diplomatically. Okay? I prefer role-playing with an E, not with two L's. Okay? I think this might be my last kind of philosophy complaint about 5th edition. But it would be time. Okay? And this kind of brings us to my last point of all, which is economy. The two are very closely linked together. Time in the old Dungeons and Dragons mattered. Okay? In the old Dungeons and Dragons, people actually died of old age. Okay? People would reach a level where they would start losing attribute points and they would retire. Okay? They would retire their characters. They'd be 14th, 15th, 16th level, and they'd be like, I'm too old for this shit. And they would retire to a castle someplace. Now, we've reached a point where time, the passage of time in the campaign, is completely irrelevant. The characters develop so quickly that, beyond the fact that they're overpowered and they become these superheroes, these unkillable superheroes, which is, I guess, let's, philosophy, right? In original D&D, you started out as just one of the guys, just some guy. You weren't the long lost prince of Akadokadoria. You weren't, a king who had been displaced from his throne. We didn't have these extravagant backstories, and you shouldn't have those extravagant backstories, because what you are in original D&D is basically some foot soldier, just some guy, some person who becomes a hero. Okay? You don't start out with a bunch of feats and skills. You don't start out as awesome and then develop to a god. Okay? You start out as just a guy, and you become, if you're lucky, some of your characters become super powerful, superhero, like not superheroes, but heroes, as opposed to 5th edition where you become superheroes. Okay, 5th edition is a power fantasy. Dungeons and Dragons was more of a war game. Okay, fundamental philosophical difference, and my preference is war game. Okay, I want you to start out as just a guy. That's how I want to start out, as just a guy. And I want my game, my story, my backstory to be the development of that, just a guy. Okay? Now, in order for that to happen, again, passage of time has to matter. Okay? And it just doesn't in a game where you can hit 20th level after 2 months of gameplay. Okay? Why even have a calendar? Why even bother keeping track of seasons? Okay? There's no point. It's the action in 5th edition, for all the reasons that I've just stated, it's nonstop. I mean, if you can heal instantly in a day, why have any downtime at all? Right? So there's no point. Nobody's going to die of old age. There's no point keeping track of time. There's no point. Again, I can get that experience by picking up any fantasy role-playing game, like video game. Okay? That's not what I'm looking for in a tabletop role-playing game. I want the passage of time to matter. I don't want everybody magically bopping from portal to portal. I want a low fantasy campaign where if you want to go someplace, you have to ride there. And it takes time to get from one place to another. If somebody's in the party is seriously injured, you're down for at least a week. If you don't have a good healer in the party, maybe a lot more. I don't want... I don't want the passage of time. I don't want this to be a video game. I want this to be a story about people. And the passage of time is such an important part of our lives as people. Okay? The process of growing and changing and getting stronger and then getting older and then starting to tremble a little and realizing that you're past your days and having to settle down and maybe have some kids, right? The passage of time defines us, okay? It defines what we are. It defines what our life becomes. And with 5th edition, we throw that away. Just throw it away. How is that linked to economy? Because that's my last great big complaint about the economy. And I've always had issues with the Dungeons and Dragons economy, okay? I mean, gold pieces? Really? That's your base currency? Gold? Right? Yeah, must be a lot of gold on these planets. You know what I'm saying? There's a rollmaster. much simple, much more sensible silver standard for their coinage, right? But that's a kind of a petty complaint about economy. My real complaint about economy is linked to time, okay? Because in the original Dungeons and Dragons, we had something we used to call domain level play, okay? Which has been completely removed from modern Dungeons and Dragons. Domain level play basically meant building a house, having someplace nice to stay other than some hotel, right? It's wintertime. We can't adventure in this weather. It's just too dangerous out there. I mean, getting killed by a Yeti, that would be bad enough. But freezing to death, yeah, that doesn't sound like my bag. Let's just sit the winter out. Well, where are you going to do that? You're gonna build a nice little estate. You're going to hire some servants, right? And oh, by the way, we have a nice little estate. We have some servants. What are we going to do when we leave? We're just going to leave all this stuff unguarded? We better hire some guys to watch the house when we're not around. You know what? I mean, it's fun finding all this like great mounds of silver, but we can't carry it all. We're going to have to bring a horse with us. We can't just leave a horse standing outside an ancient deserted fortress while we kill the monsters and loot the inside. We got to hire some guys to come along. And this is domain level play, okay? Because it grows. As your character grows, so does your domain, right? So by the time you reach a certain level, you're supposed to have a castle. Or if you're a thief, maybe you've got a secret hideout, right? You're supposed to have men-at-arms, guards, for when you're not around. And if the king calls your high-level fighter or your paladin to the castle because the kingdom is threatened, he doesn't want just your ass there. He wants you to bring soldiers, okay? You are expected, as a high-level lord with a castle, to be able to field an army when the king needs it, okay? This is called domain-level play. And the function, one of the primary functions of domain-level play, was to get players to spend all that damn gold. Okay, they have tons and tons of gold. And in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, they spend it all on, magic items. They spend it all on themselves. They spend it all on ways to increase their own personal power. There's no attempt to, in any way, indulge in domain level play, right? There's no clearing out a 20-mile radius and setting up a fiefdom of your own, trying to attract villagers, building a temple, getting a farmer to come in and raise wool, or a forester to come in and start cutting trees for your village, trying to attract people to live here. There's no 2 years spent just, with you and your friends, just defending this fledgling village from anyone who might decide that they want to take it away from you. There's no hiring an army to defend it in your absence, okay? There's no finding a competent henchman to steward the place when you're not around, okay? All of this has been lost. And this was a vital part of the old Dungeons & Dragons. And by the way, it's a vital part of any fantasy campaign. I mean, I personally prefer low fantasy. I've made that pretty clear. So, it might seem a little, Tolkien-esque to suggest that maybe once Aragorn becomes the king of Gondor, he might actually need an army, right? But Boromir, right? He was a soldier. He was a commander of men. Faramir led the Gondoran cavalry into a futile charge against orcs in Pelennor. It's a part of the fantasy genre, this domain level play, that 5th edition just throws away. So when I say economy, that's what I'm talking about. The old advanced D&D game kind of forced the players to spend their gold on something other than themselves. Okay? 5th edition, no. Okay, so what am I saying? I'm saying that Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is better than 5th edition, as far as I'm concerned. Okay? That's my personal taste. Nothing wrong with that. If you prefer 5th edition, again, nothing wrong with that. I personally find it kind of goofy. I personally find it even a little oppressive to have every game world have every race and every class because Wizards wants to sell the books. Okay? But in my opinion, that kind of strips the entire genre of it. If everything makes everything feel the same. It's limitations that make each setting unique. Okay? It's the fact that there are no orcs, there are no halflings, there are no drow in Kryn that makes Dragonlance unique. That's what makes it special. Okay? And 5th edition, it's not about having a unique setting. It's about selling books. So if Wizards of the Coast can't cram every single race and every single class and every single subclass and every single piece of treasure from every single supplement into that world, they're not interested. They don't want to publish it. That's why they hate Greyhawk, right? Because it's really just you could just use the very basic rules, right? And you'd still have to throw races out to play in Greyhawk. Okay? There are no tieflings in Greyhawk. You know what we call tieflings in Greyhawk? Cambrian demons. Okay? Because in Greyhawk, if you have demon blood, that's it. You have no choices. You have no agency. Okay? You are a demon. Mortal blood can't resist the force of hell. Okay? If you have demon blood, you're a Cambrian demon. That's what you are. You're going to be evil. Whether you want to be evil or not, you're going to be evil because the blood within you is just too strong to be resisted by a mere mortal. Okay? My agency. Yeah, you know what? Deal with it. Because that's the lore. Okay? If you want to play in Greyhawk, which is, by the way, my favorite setting, it's a low fantasy, low magic setting, and demons are evil. And there's no such thing as a tiefling. If you have demon blood, you're called a Cambrian demon. Anyway, it's a matter of preference. Okay? I ran a 5th edition campaign for 2 years. And I could go on and on about the mechanical difficulties, about how difficult it is to be a dungeon master. And by the way, another element of the simplicity of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is that it's actually easier to DM, which means you have to do less work to get the game out in time for your players. If you want them to do something unique and interesting, and you want to actually create your own monsters and create your own enemy character parties, it's a lot easier to do in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And don't come at me with, oh, but you're just lazy. I'm an old man. I got kids. I got a mortgage to pay. No, it's not a matter of being lazy. I have limits on my time. I have responsibilities. Okay? So yeah, a game system that's easier to DM makes a difference. And you know what else you have when you have a game system that's easier to DM? you have more DMs. Y'all are having a big crisis in 5th edition. You can't find enough DMs, right? The rules in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons are simpler. Ergo, people will be less intimidated, and they will have to put less of a time investment into becoming DMs themselves. Simpler rules, more DMs. A equals A. Okay? But again, if you prefer 5th edition, great. If you're a DM, you're going to have a lot easier time finding players, I'll tell you what. But personally, I find the experience old school role playing better. Subjectively, for me, the rules are just objectively better in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, Basic Dungeons and Dragons, Basic Expert, I'm supposed to say. Even the original game, I think, is better than 5th edition. 3rd edition, better than 5th edition. 4th edition sucked. 5th edition was a big step up from 4th edition. But, you know what sucked about 4th edition? A lot of the same things that I don't like about 5th edition. Okay? Look. There's a history here. Okay? I've met a lot of people who they're fine with 5th edition. It's all they've ever played. I've played both. I'm in a position to tell you that one is actually better than the other and why. Okay? If you've never played an old school role-playing game, then you're in no position to tell me I'm wrong. So here's an idea. Just try it. Find an old school role-playing game and just give it a whirl and see what you think. And don't write a 12-page backstory for your character. Roll it up an hour before the game. You can do it in an hour before the game. It's not that complicated. Okay? Roll it up an hour before the game. Show up. Say, I'm a farmer's son and I'm sick of living in the farm, so I'm just going off to make my way in the world. There's your backstory. Okay? Give it a try. See what you think. You might be surprised. Okay. Time for me to go. Thanks. Another long video. I know, short videos get a lot more views. Sorry. But not in it for the views, not in it for the likes, not in it to monetize my channel. Although I wouldn't mind one bit. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that on the next video. Because I want to grow the channel and I can't afford to. So I'm trying to think of some ways to make a little money, and we'll talk about that some other time. For now, good morning, good night, good day, whenever you watch this video. Thanks for your time. Time is the most precious thing you have to offer. I love you for giving me yours. Thank you. Peace.